Ever wonder how a professional award-winning coder would go about making a 3D website from scratch? Well, on today's tutorial, we're going to show you exactly how this is done. Well, this is Normal Sneakers. This is a website that I put together and we're going to show you how it's made. There's a few different things we can do as part of this. So we have this shoe that we can actually turn and drag and we can spin it around in space. We have this post-processing shader effect on here. So as we scroll down, it kind of goes cloudy. We also have a bunch of different effects, such as scroll effects as well. We have a preloader, so I just refresh the site. We have this fading in, moving up in space, and we have these elements fading in as well. So we're going to talk today about how we build something that's a bit more professional grade than most YouTube tutorials that talk about 3D. Now, this site was actually inspired by another site called Office for Future Furnishings. We can see there's a lot of similar things in here as well. We have this chair that's in a 3D environment that kind of floats in space, and we have these different kind of post-processing effects. We have fade effects in here as well. So we're going to make something that's quite similar to this. So in today's tutorial, we're going to talk all about Normal Sneakers and how we build this from scratch. So the first thing you might be wondering is, who am I and why am I the right person to talk on this subject? I'm Rick. I'm the CEO and founder of SuperPi online creative school. We've been teaching code and design skills since 2016. I personally have been teaching coding skills since, well, nearly 15 years now. And I've also been making professional websites for nearly 20 years as well. And I've won lots of awards for my work. Now, these aren't real awards, these are just for running. Most of these online inspiration websites don't really give you physical awards, but I have won awards from things like Site Inspire, from Godly, from Muesli, from Hover States, and so on. So I've been making professional websites from scratch, and I've won awards for it as well. And some of the sites I've done have used a lot of things like Three.js as well. So I believe that I am the right person to talk about some of these topics. So firstly, this is an intermediate tutorial. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the basics of HTML and CSS. I'm just going to do them pretty quickly. And again, if you don't know things like JavaScript, again, I'm going to go through some of the basics pretty quickly. If you don't know the basics, we do courses at SuperPi that I teach some of them as well, which do cover the basics. So if you are interested in the basics, look at superpi.com. Now, how are we going to make this site and how are we going to make it from scratch? Now, we've got a bit of a list, a bit of a shopping list of what we actually need here. So this is the rough order that I'm going to do this site. Now, the first of all is I'm going to set up a brand new project using Vite. Vite is basically a build system. The reason for using a build system is we want our site to load pretty quickly and only load the things that we want to load in rather than load all of these libraries in. We only want a bit of these libraries as well. Next, what I'm going to do is build out the HTML and CSS. So we have some content. So when I scroll down the site, we have this stuff in here, images in here, basically the base structure and the style of what our site will look like. The next thing I'll do is I'll build some fades in. So we can see, if you ignore the preloader, we have these fades in the background, this header fades in, and we also have some of these fades in on scroll as well. I'll be using something called motion to do this. The next thing I'll do is I'll add some Three.js in here as well. We're not going to start with this sneaker, but we're going to start with just a basic shape to begin with. Now the basic shape will look fairly flat to begin with. So what we'll do next is we'll add some lighting and some materials to that shape. After that, we'll add some of these orbit controls in here, which basically when we kind of drag this around, we move the shape around. Again, it won't be a sneaker just yet, but we'll also add some scroll effects on here. So if I scroll down the site, this will also turn. I can still drag this around, but this will also scroll as well. Next, what we'll do is we'll load in this model, this sneaker in here, and we'll talk about how to do that and how we kind of prepare a 3D object for this as well. Next, what we'll do is we'll add this preloader. So this will take a little bit longer. I'm on a obviously local machine. So if I'm on a website, this will take a bit longer to load in. And then what we'll do is we'll add some post-processing shader effects on here as well. Again, if you're not comfortable with shaders, we do have a course on this that I teach called Shaders for the Web, and it's really, really cool. But we'll add this kind of effect on here as well. So we'll get this cloudy effect on this as we scroll down the site. So this is the rough kind of process that I would go about this. Other people do it in a slightly different way. They might want to load the shoe in the first, but I'm going to load it in a different shape to begin with and build it up in this kind of way. So let's begin. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up our project with a build system. Now, the reason for using a build system is we don't want the whole of the libraries that we're going to be using, like Three.js. We only want a little bit of them, so our site runs a little bit quicker for our users. and it basically speeds up our development time as well. So I'm going to use one called Vite, and Vite is just really, really good. It's very easy to set up. Now, if you haven't set up anything with JavaScript before, you will need Node.js. You can just download it here. And then what we can do is use Vite, and I've been calling it Vite a few times, so I might call it Vite and Vite occasionally. And we're going to set this up as just a vanilla JavaScript project. And we can see down here how we can do this. So how do we go about setting our project up? Now, what I've got on my desktop is an empty folder, and this is called Normal Sneakers. I'm just going to open it up in our VS Code, and it's going to look something like this. Yes, I trust the authors because I made this project. And I also want to run a terminal as well. So I'm going to go to terminal, new terminal. Mine's in the kind of right hand side, but yours might be on a different one. Yours might be at the bottom. And what I want to do is set up my project using Vite. So to do this, I'm going to use npm create Vite at latest. So what I'm going to do is one little extra thing rather than just copy and paste this. I'm also going to add a space and then a dot. Space dot just means add this into this folder. So I'm going to basically set up in this folder itself. Now this will give me a few options. I could use React, could use Vue. Mine is going to be vanilla JavaScript, and it's just going to be pure JavaScript. So I'm going to go from TypeScript to JavaScript. So what this will do is it will set up my project over here on the left-hand side, and it will tell me what I need to do. Run npm install, and then to run development, npm run dev. So let's do what it tells us to. Npm install. It's going to install all the projects files that we need, and then we can do npm run dev. Now what this will do is it will give me a URL I can go to, which is this one here. So I'm just going to copy and paste this into my browser, and what we should get is hello Vite. So what we'll get in our project on the kind of left hand side is some files. We have our index.html, which looks like this. We've got some CSS in the style sheet, which looks like this. And then we've got our main.js, which is kind of where our code currently runs from. Now, there's other things in here that we don't need. There's this javascript.svg, which we're not going to use in our project. So I'm just going to get rid of it. So I'm going to get rid of javascript.svg, and I'm going to get rid of counter.js as well. And you might see there's some complaining on the right-hand side because these things don't exist anymore. Now, what I also want to do is make my main.js just empty. I'm going to take my main.js and save it as an empty, and we'll do the same thing for the style sheet. We're going to get rid of that, and in our index.html we're going to leave this as is for now, but what we should start with is an empty page. Now we want an empty page because we want to make our own code rather than using Vite's code instead, but what we start with is something that looks like this. Now, if I want to enter and exit my server, all I need to do to exit is press Control, even on the Mac, and C. Control C will get me back to the command line. If I want to run the server again, say if I restart my computer or restart VS Code, I just do npm run dev. And what I'll get is my server running again, and it will give me the URL I need to go to, my local host. Your port might be different, this number at the end might be different, but mine looks like this, localhost 5173. So this is my website, and this is kind of how I've set up my first Vite project. So currently we have an empty website, but let's start adding some content to this. So to do this, I'm going to be mainly working in my index.html and my style.css. So let's go about making a website. So currently we have in our index.html this Vite app. I'm going to change this to normal sneakers as a title, just so I've got a URL and I can see it in my tab very easily. So save, and we should get this being normal sneakers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this div with ID app. I'm going to keep everything else like my script type module at the end, because that's where my actual main.js is going to be working from. And let's add in a header. So header in here, let's add a h1 of normal sneakers and a nav in here as well. And let's add in, I think it's by, about, sizing, and by. And by. Now, this will just give me something very basic at the top, which looks like this. Now, what I want to do is start adding some assets, which I've already pre-downloaded. So I do have some asset folder here. There's things like a typography in here. We've got a logo in here, which is in white. I've got some images in here as well, so I'm just going to use them in my project. So to use them in my project, I'm actually going to open up my folder and I'm going to use them in my public folder. So I'm going to take everything and put it in my folder, apart from content.txt and my web font as well. So I'm going to copy this into my public. Now I'll talk about the web font in a minute, but the web font, I'm going to copy it into the top level version of this. So I'm using this in my style sheet and I want this in here like that. So this is just going to give me some content and things that I can actually use a little bit later. In my content.txt, I've just got the actual content for the actual projects itself. But what I want to do next is have my header, and then underneath I want my big kind of like logo kind of area. So I'm going to make a new section in here, and this is going to have a class of, let's call it new-drop. And I'm just going to put an image tag in here for this new logo. So I've got this logo.svg, and I'm just going to give it an alt attribute of new drop. Next, what I want to do is I've got my content. So I've got another section with the class of content in here, and I want an image, and this is going to be my first image, warmup.1, and this is going to be, I'll just put photo for now, and we'll put a P for paragraph, and my text is in my content.txt. Let's just open it up and use this. So I'm going to use this in my P, and there we go, and it's just gone off there. Where's it gone? Ooh, there it is. So I've got my section with content, so let's add 2 more. So here what I've got is warm up 2, warm up 3, and let's add in the content for here for this bit, and for this bit is the 3rd line. There we go. So what I'll get on my kind of empty version of the site right now is something that looks like this. So I've got my big logo in here. I've got my image with some text, image, text, image, text. So we've kind of got things set up roughly as we want to. What do we want to do next? Well, we wanted to style up the site. It kind of looks a little bit not so great right now. Now, the reason we're doing this first is we want to kind of like set a rough layout. So the site still works roughly without this kind of 3D shape in the background. So let's do that next. In my style.css, what we're going to do first of all is we're going to get rid of the default styles. And the reason for this is CSS is just old and there's stuff that we don't really want here. So this is just going to set up our basics. So there we go. And we also want to add our font face in here. So we have our font family, and this is going to be our Babus Neue. And where is this living? It's in our URL, and it's currently just here in the same directory, babusneue.regular.otf. Now we want to use that in our typography. So I'm going to do this just on HTML for now. So the font family here is Babus Neue, and let's back it up with Arial and so on after that, just in case this doesn't load for whatever reason. We'll give this a font size of 24 and a line height of 1. 1 is just a kind of percentage, so this is like 100% in Figma. So let's save, let's see if this worked. Let's refresh, and that didn't work for some reason. Let's see why. Now the reason this didn't work is previously when we had this was imported in here at the top. So what I'm going to do is just in my main.js is I'm also going to just have this line here, import, and then /style.css. This is going to build in my CSS, which means we'll get something that looks like this. This will start to look a little bit more like it should do. So we've got the correct typography in here now. So what we want to do next is set up our kind of general color scheme. I'm going to do this as a CSS variable, so root, and then I'm going to do primary color. This primary color is going to be a black, so it's going to be OA, and then our secondary color is going to be white, so pure white. And then what we can do is use these 2 colors around our project next. So next on the body, I'm going to give this a background dash color of this CSS variable, primary color, and a text color of the secondary color. And let's see if this works. There we go. We can see this title appearing now. Now what I want to do with the images is just make sure they don't expand the boxes. So I'm just going to do that next. So image is going to be max width of 100%. And let's make it a vertical line at the bottom as well. So it sits kind of flush to the bottom of the text. So this looks a little bit more like it should. Now, what I want to do next is sort out these links in the corner because currently they're purple. So let's just make them the default color of the text. So let's make this a color. Two ways to do this. I could do it as current color, or I could just set the color being secondary color. Current color just makes it the text color, as we can see up here. Now, I want to get rid of this text decoration for now. I'm going to say text decoration none. So they just look like normal bits of text. We might want to do some hover states on this. For now, I'm just going to ignore it. But what we also want to do is have a button for this buy to make it look a little bit different. Now, there isn't a way to kind of differentiate the buttons right now. I'm just going to quickly add in a class of button on buy. So what I can do is style that up. So a.button, let's make it display inline as a block. And let's give this a background color. So the color itself is going to be not the current color, but the primary color, because the background is going to be the other way around. Background is the secondary color. There we go. And what we could want to do next is we want to give it some padding. I'm going to be mainly using rems for this because I'm using this on the HTML type 24. So if I want to have quick responsiveness, I can just put the font size down on HTML instead, and it will kind of go down accordingly. So we're going to use a quarter rem, and then 0.75, and then a little bit on the bottom. And then again, this is something I just messed around with, and this kind of sits like this. I'm also going to give this some border radius as well to make it rounded. So this I'm going to do as a quarter rem as well to make it rounded. So we've got kind of like general styling going on now, but we want to kind of lay this out a little bit more nicely. So the first thing I want to do is work out the header, and then we'll work down and do the content areas next. So header next. This I'm going to do is position sticky. Let's move this down. We'll make it sticky at the top left. And let's give this some padding, rem, 2 rem. There we go. And we want to give this a width. Let's give it a width with these things, width 100%. Let's give this some flex box as well, display flex. We want it to be aligned in the center, going across the row, align items, center. So this kind of lines this way. And then we want to space them out. So we want to justify the content with space between. So this goes from here to here. Now this looks a little bit too big. I want to just tone that down a little bit. So that's the next thing I'm going to do. In my header, I've got the H1. Let's make this have font size of 1 rem. And let's also make it font weight 400 as well. So we don't want it to be bold. We just want it to be normal. So this looks good. This doesn't look so good. It looks a little bit tight. So what we want to do is add some spacing on this as well. So on my header nav, I'm going to do display flex, and I'm going to give it a gap of what? Well, let's do 1 rem. There we go. But what we also see is this kind of looks a little bit terrible. So I want to align it correctly as well. So let's align items based on the baseline. So the text baseline, so that they sit in this kind of order, which looks pretty good. Now, what I'm also going to do is give this a rough height, this kind of area up here, this header. So I'm going to give this a height of, let's do 4 rem. This might not be enough. I'm going to give this a border radius just to see if this is enough. Let's give it a red border. And we can't, oh, border. There we go. Yeah, that's about right. That's about 4. That kind of makes sense. So I'm going to get rid of this border on here so that we have this looking normal. Now, the reason I'm doing this kind of 4, just to see in the size, is for the next area. I want this kind of area to fill the entire space, but then sit at the bottom. So I know this is 4, and I know the height of this is 100 VH. And again, I can make this a little bit wider. How do we go about this? So next section, section.new drop, we called it. Let's make this have a min height, and let's calculate this, 100 VH minus 4 rem, the kind of top bit as well. So this is the header we're accounting for. So this means that if we scroll a little bit, we'll see the content peeking up from there. But what we want to do is align this image and make it full width. So next thing, section, new drop. What we want to do to make the image, let's make it width 100%. Now I'm doing this using an SVG rather than actual text. And the reason for this is Text doesn't usually work that great when we're trying to expand it and trying to like fill the gap exactly. So using an SVG that I made in Figma works pretty well. Now I want to give this some padding as well. So I'm going to give this padding on new drop. This is going to be 2 rem all the way around. And I want this to be aligned at the bottom. So here I'm going to do display flex, and let's align items at the end. And there we go. This sits at the bottom now. So what we want to do is the next section. We've got this section which looks the same for all of them. That's what we're going to do next. We're going to do a section for the content. So section, and this is called content. What we want to do here is give it a padding, 2 rem as well. And that gives it some space around each one, which looks good. Let's use a display in grid. Let's do grid template columns, template columns, 1FR, 1FR. And let's use a gap of 2 rem as well between each column so that they sit like this. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Let's make the font size a little bit bigger. Font size is 3 rem, and this just makes it a lot larger. And what we also want to do is add a bit of padding between this. So maybe there's a bit more space between these two things. Again, this is something that we just worked out, which worked pretty well. This is 3 at the top, 5 at the bottom in rems. There we go. Now, one thing we do want to do eventually is make these kind of go above different areas. So we can see here that what we want to do is maybe make the text go above the image that goes in the background, eventually the sneaker. So I'm just going to quickly do that as well. So section, content, P. I'm going to make the P position relative. And let's just make this Z index equal to 2. Now I'm doing 2 because I want the kind of image to be in the background, the sneaker to be 1, and then the text to be over that as 2. So that's kind of where these numbers come from. Now I might want to do the same thing with the titles as well. So I'm just going to quickly go up to my header and give this also a Z index of 2 because I want the header to be above the sneaker. Kind of makes sense. So this basically is giving us a basic site. There's one other thing that we could do, which is I want this to kind of like flip around. There's 2 ways to do this. One is to do it in CSS. I'm just going to do the quick way, which is going into HTML and just making in that second section our image go after the paragraph, so it flips around. So what we have is our basic HTML and CSS kind of set up. Now what we want to do is start fading things in. So the next thing I want to do is start fading things in on load. So if I refresh the page just quickly, these just are instantly here. Maybe what I want to do is fade in the header, fade in this, fade these things in when I scroll down the page. Now, how do we go about doing this? Well, I could just write all of the JavaScript and CSS myself, or I could use a library to do this. And I'm going to use motion.1 to do this. So motion.1 is kind of similar to things like GreenSock and GSAP. It's actually very lightweight as well. So it's a kind of good library to use. It's very easy to install and very easy to use. So let's talk about how we do this. So back in my code, I'm currently running my server. So I want to cancel out of this server by Control and C. Again, even if you're on a Mac, it is Control, not Command. Now what I want to do is install Motion into this project. And what we can do, npm install Motion. So npm install Motion. This will go off to the internet, find this on the internet, pull it into my project, and then just work. So once I've done this, I can run my server again. So npm run dev. So we've installed the library, now we can use it in our project. But how do we use it? Now this is using JavaScript, so I'm going to be doing this in main.js. Currently we're just doing one thing in here, we're importing the star sheet. What we can do is use our motion.1 in our project. And there's a few ways to do this. Again, it's following the instructions. We're going to use animate and in view for this. So we want to animate first of all. Now, if I click on animate, it shows us how to use it. We want to import from Motion and then tell it what we want to do. So let's do it for our project. So the first thing we need to do is after we've imported this, we're going to import animate from Motion. Now, the reason we're using a build system here is we don't want to use every single part of Motion. We just want to use animate for now. So we're just pulling this one little thing out and being like, cool, that's all we want to use. So we're using this from this library. How do we use it? Well, first thing I'm going to do is animate my header in. I'm going to use my animate function that I've just got from Motion, and then I can just follow the instructions. It says how we do it here. There's 3 different parts that go into this. The first one is a selector, I'm going to select my header first of all. What do I want to do next? I'm going to do a comma and then an object. Now the object basically says, what do I want to do? What do I want to animate? So I'm going to open this up just to make it a little bit easier to read. Now I'm going to animate the opacity for now. The opacity is going to go from, in square brackets, 0 to 1. Now there's a third part to this, which I'm going to do after this curly bracket, but before the round bracket. And I'm going to add another object in here as well, because we need to know how we're animating and then what we're doing to the animation, how long. So here what we're going to say is duration. How long do we want it to go on for? For now, we're just going to say 1 for 1 second. Now I'm going to save this, and because I've got a kind of formatter set up, it looks a little bit different, but we can see here that we've got header, what we're changing, and how long we want to change it for. So let's see if this works. So back on our site, if I refresh the page, we'll see here that this will refresh in. Now you might notice there's a bit of a flicker sometimes, and again, this is just because we're using like local development, and again, you know, this sometimes goes away, but we can see this sometimes kind of like loading a little bit slower. So there we go, it's fading in. Now we might want to do other things like slide it down, for instance. So where would we do this? Well, this is like how it animates. This is like what we're actually animating. This is how long. So we can do it in here. Now, again, motion has this really great way, which is just adding Y. We can say -100 and go to 0. So start at -100 and go to 1. Let's save this, see how it looks. And what we can see here is this fades in and slides down. Fades in and slides down. So it's very easy to add in Motion 1 to a project. Now, I don't want it to do it just on the header. I also want to do it on this new drop section here. So underneath, I'm going to do animate and say section.newDrop. I'm going to add in a object here, and I'm going to do pretty much the same thing. I'm going to say Y, and this is going to go from -100 to 0. And then let's do the opacity as well, 0 to 1. And then what we want to do is how long for. So duration is 1. Now what we can also do is add in a delay on this. So if we look right now, they both happen at the same time, which feels like they're tied together. So let's actually add a little bit of a delay. So on the first one, I'm going to do a delay of something like 2.5, sorry. So this is going to give you a 2.5 second delay, and it'll kind of slide in. And I'm going to do a delay on this one of just 2. So this fades in, and then this fades in. So this kind of looks pretty good to me. Again, if I refresh, this is going to take 2 seconds to load in. Now remember that we're going to be loading in the sneaker a little bit later as well, so this might want to load in after that. So what we want to do next is fade these other things in. Now we can do this again using motion. If we look at our kind of list, we have animate, timeline, stagger, spring, glide. There's this thing called in view. So in view, we want to use next. Now to use in view, we want to take this from our library in motion and then use it. So we haven't got this imported just yet because we've only got animate imported from motion. So the next thing we want to do is add in our in view. So here, animate, comma, in view. Basically, we want to take this from motion 1 and use it in our project. But how do we use it? So what we're going to do next is under here, we're going to say if this is in view, what we want to do is animate it in. So in view, what do we want to do? Well, we want to listen out for our section.content. Now remember, we've got 3 section.contents in here, so they're going to be in view at different areas. So what we want to do is run this whenever it's in view. To run things, we're going to add a function. So we're going to do a comma and then a function in here next. Now what I would also need is to tell it what thing are we talking about, what has come in view. So this has been given to us by Motion 1. I'm just going to write this as info. It's going to give us some info about this. Next, what I want to do is say, when this is in view, what do we want to do? I'm going to open up these curly brackets and say, well, as soon as this is in view, I want to animate it in. So we're going to use animate next. What do we want to animate? Well, not all of the sections, just the section that is in view. Now to do this, we could get it from motion. We can say info.targets. And this is something that's built into Motion 1. What do we want to do in here? Well, we want to select the whole thing and fade it in. So let's just do this. So let's add in for now opacity 1, and what we want to do is duration 1 and a delay of 1 as well. So let's see if this works. So if we scroll down, let's start at the top. So this should fade in after 2 seconds. There we go. And as we fade down, they've not quite worked. Now, the reason that they've not worked just yet is because they were faded into 1 to begin with. So we need to actually just fade them out to begin with as well. So I'm going to do this before here. So they're currently faded into 1, right? So I'm going to do animates here for all of the section.content. And what I want to do is just make them opacity 0. So this is just going to animate them out to 0, and then when they're in view, animate them in. So what we should get now is if I refresh the page, they'll be animated to 0 in the background, and then when I scroll down, they'll fade in at different times. There we go. So what we've just done is we've used Motion 1 to actually add our animations in here. We've not done it in too much code actually, and we're using the library to do most of the hard work itself. So we could just end here. The site looks pretty good as is. We've got some fade effects on here, but what we want to do is add a bit of 3D to this. How do we go about this? Well, we're going to be using a library called Three.js, and it's a really great library for adding 3D to the web. And it's very easy to use as well. There's a lot of elements to it, but we'll talk about this piece by piece. Now, the first thing we need to do is actually install this, and it'll give you a kind of quick way to do this. And it looks something like this. And if you look here, we want to use npm and a build tool. We've got npm, we've got a build tool set up, so it should be fairly straightforward. So what we're going to do is go back to our project. We're going to cancel out of our server, Control and C, and what we need to do is install 3. So npm space install 3. So this will go off and basically it takes this from the internet and installs it into our project. It might take a minute or two for you if it's the first time you've done this, but once we've done it, we've got 3 installed, we can run our server again, npm run dev. Now, how do we use 3 in our project? Now, what we can do is quickly go to the Three.js website, and there's this area called creating a scene. So we're just going to take a lot of this stuff, but then repurpose it to make it a little bit cleaner in our code. So the first thing we're going to do is basically copy this code here. So I'm going to copy this code from here into my project at the bottom. Now, what we're going to do is move things around just quickly because I like to keep things together because I want my imports together. I want my kind of loading stuff to be together as well. So I'm going to take this import start as 3 and move it to where my motion one is, kind of towards the top. Doesn't really matter, but it's just keeping my code clean. Now let's save this and see what it's done. Has this done anything at all? So normal sneakers. This has done what? Nothing much. Now again, there's more to our creating a scene bit. So what we're going to do is scroll down to the next bit. There's this geometry area. So I'm going to take this and copy this into my project. And the next area is like this. I'm going to save this, and what we should see next is nothing at all. Like, is there anything in here? No, there isn't. So what we want to do next is keep following the instructions. So in here, there's a render in the scene area. So what we see here is we need a render on animate loop, and let's use this. So I'm going to paste this in. Now this won't work. Now the reason why it won't work is because we're already using something called animate up here, animate from motion. So I'm just going to change the name of this animate in this bit to render. So I'm just going to change the function name to render, this one in request animation frame to render, and then this one to render as well, just so we're not confusing it with a different library. Now, did this work? Let's have a look. So back on our site, let's refresh, and what we should see is nothing at the top, but if we scroll all the way down, we have this cube. Now this cube looks kind of weird. It's not really doing anything right now, so let's make it do something. So to make it do something, we're going to keep following the instructions, and what we'll see here is animating the cube. It says call this in your animate function. Ours is now called render, remember? So we're going to use this in our render function just at the top here. So let's paste this in our render function, and let's see if this does anything. What we should see is a cube spinning around in space now. Now, of course, this is in the wrong place. We can see that this is not behind things. It's actually just at the bottom of the page right now. So what I want to do is put it in the right position, but also clean up some of this code. This is just kind of like copy and paste code. It doesn't really mean too much right now. So the first thing I'm going to do is make this cube be in the background of this. We want a place to put this in. So back in my index.html, what I'm going to do is maybe kind of after this new drop area, actually maybe let's do it after the header. So let's do a section and we'll give this a class of sneaker. Now in this section, I'm just going to put a comment in here. This is where Three.js lives. So this is kind of where we want this to go eventually. It's not in there right now, but we'll kind of aim towards that. Now what I want to do is style this sneaker area so it sticks when I scroll up and down the site. So what we're going to do is style this up next. So in my style.css, I'm going to do this just after the header area, just before the new drop, just to kind of make it the same. So section dot sneaker, I want this to be position fixed in the top left corner. I want this to be width 100%. I want the height to be 100%. And I want the Z index to be 1. Now we said 1 and 2. 2 is above, 1 is the sneaker, 0 is the kind of back. So what we should get now is the same as before. Now the reason it's the same as before is this isn't in my sneaker area, because if we look at the code in main.js, this is just adding it to the end of our body. So document.body append this renderer. So I don't want it to be at the end of this. What I want it to be is in a certain tag. So I'm going to add a tag. I want to select a tag first of all. Now I'm going to do this towards the top. Now I like to do all my tag selection at the top, then my stuff after that, just to kind of clean my code up. So I'm going to make a constant up here called sneaker tag. This is going to be equal to, in my document, let's do a query selector, and we'll select the section.sneaker. So I've got this thing called sneaker tag now, let's use it. So sneaker tag, I'm going to use, instead of this appending to my document body, I'm going to replace this and say sneaker tag append child. So basically add my Three.js stuff into this tag that I've just made. So let's save, and let's see this in action. So now what I'll get is on the site, when we load things, this will be above everything. You'll notice the headers there, but it's above everything because this background of this thing is also black. So it's kind of covering different areas as well. So we can see here that the text is in the right place, but the rest of it isn't. So we need to kind of fix this stuff a little bit more. How do we do this? Well, what I want to do is just make this background transparent so we can see through it. So how do we go about doing this? We need to add a little bit of code in here. And again, this is all to do with Three.js. We're using the Three.js library to do this. So this isn't going to follow the instructions anymore. We're not just going to do create and scene. We're going to go our own way. So the first thing we're going to do after we've got this render size, we'll do the renderer. And what we want to add is set clear color. What do we want the background to be on every frame? Well, this we want to be kind of a see-through black. So we're going to use OX 000000, comma 0. Now, you might be wondering, what is this OX 000000? This is just basically a color in WebGL. It's kind of similar to a hex color here. So this is going to be a black color, similar to if we had hash 000000, and this is the alpha transparency as well. So this is 0. So what we'll see now is if we refresh the site, we'll see our cube being above new drop, and then kind of above things. You see this kind of flicky stuff occasionally. We'll talk about how to fix the flicky stuff every now and again. But what we have now is a cube appearing above things. What we're going to do next is just clean up the code a little bit. Now, why should we clean up the code? Now, what we kind of remember from before is we had this import, animate, and InView. Basically, we didn't want everything from motion, but what we have on 3 is we have everything from 3, which is pretty heavy. So what we're going to do is just get rid of 3, but just pick the things off the shelf that we need instead. What do we need off the shelf from 3? Well, here we've got 3 dot something, 3 dot scene, 3 dot perspective camera, 3 dot this, 3, 3, 3, 3. So there's a few things we need from our shopping list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things. So let's clean up our code. Now, the reason we're doing this again is we don't want to load everything, we just want to load the things themselves. So we're going to change import star as 3 to import curly brackets, and then we're going to pick the things that we need. So I'm just going to open this up again, just to make this easier as a shopping list almost. So the first thing we need is scene. So import scene from 3. Now this will break the code for now, but we'll fix it in a minute. We also need perspective camera. So I'm going to use that. I like to kind of keep things alphabetical. It's just personal preference. So I'm just going to kind of do things like this as we need them. Box geometry is a B, so it goes at the start. Oops, box geometry. And I've got a mesh basic material, which goes M for mesh. And then I've got the mesh as well. And my auto formatter's not making it go on different lines. There we go. Now this, basically I've got the 6 things in here, but what I want to do is use those 6 things from 3. So we're just going to go into our code and say, we don't need this 3 dot anymore because we're using scene directly from 3. Got a new scene, new perspective camera, new WebGL renderer, new box geometry, new mesh material, and new mesh as well. This actually looks a bit cleaner personally as well. So it's not only more optimized, it's also cleaner in our code. So what we get now is the same thing from before, but what we have is a little bit cleaner of code. One more thing I'm going to clean up before we kind of move on is I don't really like using function render. I actually like to use this as variables, just personal preference. So I'm just going to change this function from this to constant render, and then we're going to run it as a normal function. So something that looks like this. Now we've already got this curly bracket down here, which matches up with this one. Again, this is just personal preference. I like to keep my code kind of similar everywhere. This is just a constant equal to a function. And what we have here is the same thing as before. We've got our cube moving in space. We've got our things fading around. There's a few bits that we can fix. So this kind of flicky thing here, we'll fix a little bit later. But what we have now is some Three.js and a 3D object in our website. So currently a cube is a fairly boring shape. How do we add something a little bit different? Now I'm not going to load in my sneaker just yet, but I just kind of want to make something a bit more interesting. So when we do some lighting, it looks a little bit more interesting than just a cube. So what we can do is go into our documentation, and if we scroll down the sidebar, there's a bunch of stuff. If we look at geometries we can actually use. So currently we're using box geometry, which we can see when we go back to our code, box geometry here. We could use something else. I'm going to use a torus knot, which looks pretty cool. Now, again, this isn't going to be the end shape, but we'll use it just for now. How do we use it? Well, we want to import it and then use it in the way that it says. A radius, a tube, how many segments in each. So let's add this in. So I'm going to replace my box geometry, which I don't need anymore. I'm going to get rid of that for a torus knot. Torus knot geometry. And then what we want to use is this in our project. So instead of box geometry, we're going to get rid of that for a torus knot geometry. How big is this? Well, this is 10 and 3. Let's try this. So we'll replace these numbers, 10, 3. And then let's kind of just follow the instructions. So 116. Is this too big? Probably. There we go. We're way too close to this right now. So we kind of got a bit too, this looks pretty cool anyway, but maybe not quite what we want as user friendly. So let's make this a little bit smaller. This 10 is way too big. So maybe something like 4 and 2. Let's try and refresh. Again, this is still way too big. So maybe something like 2 and 1. There we go. It's looking a little bit better. Still taking up a lot of the screen. So maybe something like 1 and 0.5. There we go. Again, it's still quite thick. So I'm going to change the second number to 0.25. There we go. Looking a little bit better, but currently we have this like torus knot, which looks fairly flat. Now there's a few things that we can do to make it look a little less flat. The main thing we're going to do is change its material. So at the moment we've got this mesh basic material. It's got this color of green. So what we want to do is just quickly replace this mesh material with something that's different, something that has lighting on it. A mesh basic material doesn't have any lighting. There's no lighting in our scene just yet. But if we want to change the color, we could just change it here. So red would be FF0000, for instance. We have a red thing in here now. What we want to do is replace this with something different. So what we're going to look at in our sidebar is our materials. So if we scroll down to materials, we've got our mesh basic material. But we could change it to something else, something like a standard material or a Lambert material, something that kind of similar to this. So that's kind of really where we want to go. So maybe let's use this mesh Lambert material. Remember that our final material is going to be decided by a 3D program instead. So it doesn't really matter too much. We're just testing this out for now. So I'm going to replace my mesh basic material with a mesh Lambert material. But at the moment, we're not importing this. We're not using this in our project. So we need to get rid of mesh basic material and import it. And if we save this now, and let's see what this looks like. So ours looks very dark, even though we said the color of it is red. Now, why has this kind of disappeared? The reason it's disappeared is there's no lighting to see this. So the previous one didn't care about lighting. This one does. So what we need to work on next is adding some lighting. Now, there's a few ways to do this. And again, it's in the sidebar. We can see here that we've got this lighting area up here. So we've got things like ambient light, directional light. We've got a point light and a spotlight. So the first thing I want to do is add an ambient light. Ambient light is just saying like have some kind of background lighting. We're not in a kind of like dark space. So we're going to use ambient light first of all. So I need to import this. I'm going to import a ambient light into my project. So the first thing we need to do is add this. So I'm going to add this before we add the geometry. So let's add some space here for lighting. So the first thing I'm going to do is add some ambient light. I'm just going to add a new constant called ambience. And this is a new ambient light. And what we want to do here is follow the instructions. We have a color and then we need to add it. So the color is just a soft white light. Let's actually use this. So 0x and then 404040. And we need to add it to the scene. So here it says scene add light, scene add ambience, because that's what ours is called. So let's save this. Let's see if this makes any difference. So this hasn't made a huge amount of difference, but we could just turn up the light to see if it did. So let's make it just pure white for now, just to see if this does make a difference. And we can see that it does make some difference on this. Still looks a little bit dark, but this is just because it's ambient light. So I'm just going to replace it back to the normal one that we've got. So this looks quite dark. It's a little bit red. It's not black, but it's, you know, the background kind of noise to this. Now, what I want to do is add some directional lights to kind of say, imagine there's kind of like a light here, a light here, and a light here. Now, there's a few ways that we can do this in kind of like, you know, professional lighting. So something that's kind of a common way to do things in lighting, and I'm just going to find it in my notes, is a key, fill, and backlight. So we're going to use this as directional lights. So again, this is in my instructions. I've got directional light here. I want light coming from different angles to light it in a different way. So we're going to import our directional lights because we need to use this from 3. And next, what we're going to do is add a key light. Key light is the kind of like main source of light that we're going to use. Let's add a new directional light. We want this to be a pure white. So OX and then FF. And let's make this strength of 1. So let's add this to our scene. So scene, add a key light. So let's see right now. There we go. We've got this kind of lighting kind of appeared. Now, is this in the right position? Maybe not. So what we're going to do is we're going to put it into the right position. We're going to get our key light dot position, and let's just set this to a different place. Now, the one that worked well for me is -1, 1 and 3. So X, Y, and Z. X is across, Y is up and down, and Z is kind of towards you. So this kind of worked well for me. It might be different for you. Again, it depends on the shape as well. This is kind of like coming from this forward angle, lighting this up. Now, with this, I'm actually going to use 3 lights. I'm going to use my key light, my fill light, and backlight. So I've got 3 different lights in here. My fill light is also a directional light. This is also a white light, but this is a little bit less strong at just half. Now my fill light is going to be in a different position. I'm going to set it to be 1, 1, 3. So 1 is on the left, 1 is on the right, and I need to add it to my scene. So fill a light. And the last one I'm going to do is a backlight, and this is also a new directional light as well. And this is again a white light, and I did put this to 1, it kind of worked well. Backlight, and let's set the position. This I'm going to put at -1 and 3 because this is higher up in the Y scale, and this is behind as well, so -1. So scene, add backlight. So this is just kind of like standard lighting material that we're kind of doing. So what we'll get is something that looks like this, something that looks a little bit more natural if there was this thing floating in space, being natural, of course. So this is just adding some light into the scene, and what we get is a bit more control. If we want to change the color of this, we can easily do it down here in the material itself. We can change it back to a pure green color if we wanted to, and we get this kind of more natural lighting going on. So currently this torus knot just spins around in space on its own. So how would we make it have some controls where I can click and drag? Well, luckily 3 has a library for this. So if we look in our kind of sidebar again, if we scroll right down to the bottom, we'll have these different add-ons that we can use. Add-ons in controls, there's things like orbit controllers, there's things like an arcball controller, there's a map controller. I'm going to be using this thing called an orbit controller. Now, because this is an add-on, then I have to install it separately than 3 itself. To do this, I'm going to use this kind of code here and then basically set this up. So how to go about doing this? So the first thing I'm going to do is import my orbit controllers from this thing. I'm going to copy this line of code and paste it into mine at the top. I like to keep things together, of course, so I'm doing my imports, then my tags, then doing stuff. So I'm going to do this after here. So I've imported this, but I need to use it. How do we use it? Well, again, there's some instructions here. What we have is a new orbit controls based on the camera and the renderer. We want to set it in a position and then basically do the things we want to do. So how do we use this? So in my code, I'm going to do this after the lighting. Actually, maybe let's do this after the kind of torus has been added. So next, we're going to do some controls. What do we want to do in our controls though? So we've got a constant controls. This is a new orbit controls. And what we want to do is add the camera to this. Now, also what I want to do is then say what the renderer is, because this is kind of what it says here. And this is going to be renderer DOM element as well. So next what we want to do is controls. What does it say here? Controls.update. Controls.update. There we go. And the last thing we want to do is add it into our render or animate function here. So I'm going to do this instead of this cube rotation. So I'm going to get rid of the rotation of the cube and say controls.update. So save and let's see if this works. So back in my project, this has stopped spinning because I've removed it now. But what we get is this spinning in space. Now there's a few things we want to do as part of this. So we can add this like auto rotate, but we can actually zoom in as well. So using the mouse wheel, which I might want to get rid of. Now there's a few things in here that we can actually remove. So we can see there's some properties in here that we might want to remove. So we don't want to do things like zoom. We don't want to do things like panning as well. We want to keep it in the middle. So let's get rid of a few things. Again, this is to do with the orbit controls. So I'm going to say, first of all, controls. I want to say enable zoom is false because I don't want to zoom in. Controls enable pan, false. So now what I'll get is I'm doing my mouse wheel now. This isn't doing anything, but I can still turn it around. So that makes sense. The next thing I want to do is make it auto rotate because there's things in here that let it does that. So I want to say auto rotate is true and then give it a speed. So controls auto rotate is true. And we could also say controls auto rotate speed. And then let's make this 2 works well for us. So let's try 2. And what we'll get now is this auto rotating, and we've also got the ability to control this as well. Now, one thing you might notice is if we turn this around, our lighting does change as well. So the reason for this is orbit controls is based on the camera. And what we're doing is we're turning the camera based on the lights is on the scene itself. So basically the whole thing is turning around. The lights are moving with this as well. Now there is a way to kind of fix this. lighting pressure, because I actually like it where the lights stay in position and not kind of move around with this. And what I'm going to do is say where I've got my lights in. Currently they're all added to the scene, but what I can do is actually add it to the camera instead. So here I'm going to say camera.add where I've got my light in. So camera, camera, camera. Now I'm keeping my cube added to the scene, but my lighting is added to the camera. But if I save this now and go back, then my thing disappears. Why has this disappeared? Well, technically my camera isn't added to the scene itself either. So what I'm going to quickly do is say scene, add camera. And what this will do is it'll add the lighting with this, because the lights are added to the camera and then the camera needs to be added to the scene. And what this will do now is if I turn it around, this is turning around the shape, but not the actual lighting as well. The lighting stays in position based on the camera. So we're doing this slight different tweak to this, but it works a little bit nicer in my opinion. So this is kind of how we can do orbit controls. So currently, if we load the page, this suddenly appears and it doesn't really animate in, but wouldn't it be nice if it kind of like came in from the bottom? Now, because we've added this control on here, what we might want to do is still have this kind of moving around, but what we want to do is kind of fade this in or kind of come from the bottom instead. So what we're going to do is add a few kind of like layers to this to make it animatable. So to do this, we're going to go back to our code. And where we've got this geometry material in a cube, now currently this isn't a cube, so I'm just going to change this to shape and shape here, because obviously it's not a cube. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a few groups to this. And the reason for adding groups is I want to control things in different ways. I want to control my spinny shape, but I also want to have a separate area which is basically shifting it in from the bottom on load. So how do we go about this? Well, what I'm going to use is a group in Three.js. So in my import at the top, I'm going to also import group. Group is a little bit like adding a group in something like Figma or a new tag in HTML. It's basically just grouping things in a certain way. So currently what I have is my shape, and we're adding the shape directly to the scene. So I'm going to add some space here, because what I want to do is add the shape to a group, and then that group to another group, and then maybe that group to another group, because they all control things a little bit differently. So first thing I'm going to do is have a new constant called a load group, let's call it, and this is going to be equal to a new group. And this group is just imported from Three.js. And what I want to do is have that load group actually appearing at the bottom and then fading up. So load group, we want to set the position of this to be down. So this is in the Y direction. So let's set this to something like -10. So we're going down here. Now what we want to do is add the shape to this load group, and then add this load group to the scene. So load group, actually we want to do, load group. We want to add the shape here. Now notice we've got this shape added twice because we've got it added here and here. But what I'm going to replace this scene add shape is actually scene add load group, because what we want to do is fade this in, or kind of like pull this in from the bottom. So this has currently disappeared because technically that shape is off the bottom of the screen now. But what we can now do is use this animate function to take this load group and then fade it up, move it up instead. So where am I doing all my kind of animations right now? Well, technically I'm doing them up here. So I'm just going to kind of piece this together underneath because it kind of goes together. So I'm going to do an animate. Now what animate would usually do is it looks at something in HTML, but this isn't in HTML. This is actually part of JavaScript and Three.js. But what we can do with animate, and this is from Motion 1, is we can still animate things. So to do this, instead of this kind of like thing being a kind of like, quoted header or section, this is just going to be a function. So function is going to be this. Function is round brackets, arrow, curly brackets. Now the first thing I'm going to do is have this as a timeline instead. So this is going to be T for timeline. And then in our curly brackets, we're going to say what happens across this timeline. Now the next thing we want to do is add in a comma and some curly brackets for an object, because we want to say how long this timeline should be. So I'm going to give this a duration of 2 seconds, and let's start with a delay of 1 second. So this function here is going to run at 2 seconds 1 second in for 2 seconds. Now, what we can do here using this timeline is between 0 and 1, is basically do some math. So here, a load group, I'm going to change its position in the Y direction to be watts. Well, we want to start at the timeline at -10. And then what we want to do is shift towards it being to 0. So if this is between 0 and 1, I kind of want it to be between 0 and 10, from 0 to 10 shift. So I'm going to say plus 10 times t for the timeline. So the start of this timeline, this will be 0, so it'll be -10. And at the end of the timeline, this will be 1, so it'll be -10 plus 10, which is 0. So let's see if this works. So I'm going to save this now, and let's refresh, and this will fade in like this. So again, I'll refresh, this will fade in, and this is now draggable as well. So even if this is moving around, this will still work. Now, one other thing I might want to do is have this on scroll as well. So I want to shift this around on scroll, not just on this kind of load. Now, what I'm going to do here is add another group, because this is going to control the rotation separately than this animation. So let's add one more in here. So add a scroll group, and let's make this equal to new group. And what we want to do is, well, this doesn't have any position, it's just got a rotation that we're going to use. So let's say we want to add the load group to the scroll group, and then the scroll group to the scene. So what we're going to say is scroll group, let's add in the load group, and then let's add this scroll group to the scene. So this is almost like nesting tags a little bit. So scroll group. So currently this isn't doing anything, so this should work kind of the same as before. So let's just check. This scrolls in, and then obviously as we move down the page, this doesn't do anything. Now what we can do here is basically add this scroll group's rotation in the render itself. So in render, what we can say is a scroll group dot rotation. What we can do is set it, and what we can set it to is something like 0, and then we want to turn in which direction. Like not X, we want to change in the Y direction. So we're going to change it to 0, 0 for now. So X, Y, and Z, currently 0, 0, 0. But what we can do is change the second one to be based on the scroll position. Window, scroll, Y. So let's see if this works. So let's save and refresh. This goes in. And what we can do, as soon as we start scrolling, this is way too strong. We can see here it's kind of flicking around really, really quickly. And that's because this number here is based on radians. It's based on somewhere between 0 and 2 pi as a kind of turn. 2 pi is around 6. So a whole rotation is 6 pixels right now. So let's just times this by a number, 0.01. So what we'll get now is this. This is still too quick in my opinion, but let's kind of reduce that down to 0.01. How's that look? So now, yeah, there we go. It's a little bit smoother. So this is kind of turning in space. We can kind of still keep turning this around. This will still turn. So we've got 3 different groups that are controlling different things here. So what we've done here is we've added a animate thing. So we've got animated on load, but then what we've got is another group that's just controlling the actual turn of this. I like to keep these things separate because they do different jobs. So one group is doing one around moving in, one's doing one job around turning, and then we've got these orbit controls on the general group itself as well. So there's 2 things I want to fix before we move on. Now the first one you can see is if I resize the browser, this stays in the same position. So I kind of want this to be a bit more responsive. So that's the first thing I'm going to fix. The second one is you might have noticed that this kind of flicks in occasionally. So you'll notice here, if I refresh, this can suddenly flick on text. So this pops in and out occasionally. Now there is a reason for that as well. So we'll fix that in a sec. So the first thing we're going to do is we'll make our kind of Three.js thing a bit more responsive. So let's do this. So back in our code, why is this not responsive right now? So we'll see if we look at our camera and our renderer up here. These are currently set to the window width, but they never update. So we're going to fix this. So what we need to do is add in a resize function. So here I've got my render function. I'm also going to add in a resize function. And again, resize is something I've just made up. It could be called resize the whole thing, and then that's kind of it. Resize, what do we want to do on resize? Well, what we want to do is fix the renderer and the size of the actual frame. So I want to update, where has it gone? This line and this line. And again, this is part of Three.js. It's something that we can actually just pull out the instructions, but I'm just going to do it quickly. So the camera, we want to change its aspect ratio. This is based on the kind of like ratio of the height and width of the window. So this is the window width divided by window inner height. Now, if you are doing something that's a different kind of size, so let's say it sits within a certain tag, for instance, then obviously this would be based on the tag size itself. But this, we're doing full screen, so this kind of makes sense. So the next thing we need to do is tell the camera that we've changed the aspect ratio. So we want to update the projection matrix. Now, that sounds very complex, but basically it just says, hey camera, we've updated the aspect ratio, you should update as well. The next thing we're going to do is change the size of the renderer because that's the size of the actual tag. So renderer.set size, and this is going to be the window inner width and the window inner height. Now, currently we're not running resize, it's actually grayed out here. So what we need to do is just update this as well. So window, add an event listener. If we resize the window, what do we want to do? We want to run a resize. So what this will do now is it will fix the resize issue. So let's just check. If we go smaller, then it should kind of resize accordingly. So let's make this quite small. There we go, it's a little bit smaller. So this is based on the actual size of this entire window width and window height now. Now the other thing we want to fix is based on this kind of fade in. So occasionally you'll get this kind of like text fade in and kind of go above. And this is actually based on kind of a z-index problem. Now the z-index problem we have is actually based on our style sheet. So at the moment, if we look right at the bottom, we've got content P, this is z-index 2. But what we're doing technically in our code when we fade these things in, if we go up to our area up here with our section content in view, this is basically taking the whole content area and saying, this is what we should fade into. Now, what we want to do here is not fade the content area, but actually the content P and the image individually so that we don't have these like z-index updates. So we're going to actually go and fix our code here. So first thing we're going to do is on animate section.content. We don't want to update the content tag. We want to update the P and the image inside of it. So content section P and then content image. What we do want to do though is in our in view, we do want to fade it in on that entire section, but we don't want to animate it on that. We want to listen out for that whole area and then animate the two things in instead. And we can just use normal CSS, normal JavaScript here. So instead of info target, we want to do info target and then pick the P and image tag. So we're going to do a query selector all on the P and image within each section that we want to fade in. So this is just a z-index issue that we're trying to fix, that we're trying to get around, so we don't have this like flicky thing going on. So let's see if this works, and it should fix this very nicely. So this is always over the top, and this one's always behind, and there's no flicking going on here. So what we've done is we've added just a few little fixes that kind of improves our users' quality and the responsiveness of this website. So this was the point where I was gonna load in the 3D model, but actually what we're gonna do is some post-processing first, partly because if you don't have the 3D object, then we can still do it on the default objects in here as well. So how do we go about adding this post-processing using shaders? Now, if you've never heard of shaders before, don't worry about it. We'll go quite quickly over this. We do have a shaders course at SuperPy, Shaders for the Web, which I teach. I highly recommend it if you are interested in more kind of like post-processing type of effects. This would be the way to do it. So how do we do it in Three.js particularly? Now, luckily on the sidebar in the Three.js manual, it can tell you a little bit more about how this works. So there's two ways to do post-processing. One is actually on the model itself. So as in like, we make the model more like jaggedy and change its like actual material, or we can do it across the entire thing. For us on this one, it looks like it will be across the entire thing, as in it's like a sheet over the Three.js object. So we're going to be using post-processing. So to use post-processing, what we have is something that looks like this. Now they're using a glitch pass in here. We're not going to do a glitch pass, but we're going to do our own. But for now, I'm going to take all of these models in here and we're going to paste it into our project. So I'm going to do this after our all but controls. And then what we want to do is set this up. So how do we set this up? Again, it's following the instructions. So I'm going to set up a composer. A composer is basically like a renderer. So instead of this, we have down here, we have our, let's do this before the render thing. So we've got our camera position. The next thing we want to do is add in our composer. So let's add in a title here, post-processing. Post-processing. Let's set up a composer. And this is equal to a new effects composer. And we want to pass in the renderer for this as well. So basically this lets us take what the image is and then mess around with it. Now, what we want to do instead is actually change the composer from this. So what we have right now is renderer.render. We're going to replace this with this composer. I spelled composer wrong. Let's put it in the E in there. So it's not an OR, it's ER, just to make it correct. And what we want to do is render the composer instead. So let's update that. What we want to do next is, if you look down, we need to pass in the things we're trying to do. We've got a render pass, which is do the usual thing, then do the change. Here is a glitch. We're going to change it to our own thing. And then eventually we have an output pass as well, which is at the end of the chain. So we need this start and this end and something in the middle. We're not going to use glitch. We're going to make our own. So we're going to use a render pass first of all. I could just take this code and paste this after our composer. And we also want to do something. We're going to do that later. And we're going to do an output pass at the end. So what we've done here is we said, let's start with this and then let's end with this. But what we should see right now is if we go back to our site, this should look the same as before. Now, the reason it looks the same as before is because we're just doing the render and then just doing an output straight away. But what we want to do is some kind of like effects on this, our own effects. Now, if we look at Three.js, they do have some in the examples. If you search post-processing, or just processing, maybe there is all one word. They have quite a few things in here that you can just basically pick off the shelf that we could use. So the glitch one looks like this. I'm not going to use glitch. I'm going to make my own instead because we're making a custom site, right? So how do we go about that? So back in our docs, post-processing, what we want to do is add our own, not built-in, but we want to make our own custom pass. So what we want to do is make a shader pass and then our own version of this. So to do this, the first thing I'm going to import is the shader pass. We're going to make our own shader, and I need to add this to my code. So instead of I've got my glitch pass, I'm going to replace it for our shader pass instead. Next, what we want to do is import a shader and then use it in here. So I don't want to use this one. I want to make my own. So it says here, the repository provides a file called copy shader, which is a good starting point for our own shader. So we're going to make our own shader next. How do we do this? We're going to make a new file and we're going to call this noise-shader.js. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to our copy shader link down here, which looks like this. And I'm going to use this. I'm going to go to the raw version and copy and paste this into my noise shader. Now this is called copy shader, so I'm just going to update it to noise shader, and there's noise shader here. And there's a noise shader right at the bottom as well. Then what I can do is start to use this in my project instead of this being a kind of like off-the-shelf one. So how do we do this? I'm going to go back here. It says we import it and then we pass it in and then add it as a pass. So let's do that. So in our code, we're going to, instead of this shader pass underneath, we're also going to import our noise pass. Is it called noise pass? Noise shader. We want to import this from not Three, but from our own project. So /noise shader. Next, we want to do is use shader pass with noise shader. So we're going to go down and we're going to go find our post-processing area. And instead, what we want to do is add a new noise pass. This is equal to a new, let's have a look, shader pass. And what we want to use is our noise shader in here. And then what we want to do is use it as a pass. Composer, add pass for this noise pass. So let's see how this looks. It shouldn't do anything right now. So it looks the same as before and it still spins around. Now, the thing that we want to do is we want to add our own shader to this. So what is a shader, first of all? A shader is basically a program that runs per pixel. Generally, when we've done this stuff in JavaScript, we're running things across a browser page. But a shader is basically a per pixel kind of program. So we're basically editing textures, essentially. And this is kind of what we want to do here. So we're just going to switch back to our noise shader.js and just start to play around with this. There's 3 different areas as part of this. We have our uniforms, vertex, and fragment shader. Uniforms are basically information from outside, such as from JavaScript, our own JavaScript, that tells us some info. Vertex shader is to do with shapes, fragment shader is to do with textures. Because we're working on this as a general area, this is really kind of messing with the texture of this, the fragment shader. So what we can start to do is play around with some of this info. Now, what we have here is 3 things. We've got an opacity, which is just, how opacity should be across the whole texture. T-diffuse is basically the actual thing that's passed in from Three.js, like the image at the end. And then UVU is basically where the coordinates are for this thing. So what we can start to play around with now just quickly is maybe what we want to say is something like, let's add a bit of info to this. Let's just play around and see what happens. So in this void main, which is a shader program, we're going to do uvu.x, and then we're going to say times equals 0.5, just to see if this works. So what we should get now is if we look back at our thing, this is going to do anything. Nothing's happened, which kind of makes sense. Did I break things already? Maybe let's try something else. Let's try to add something to this. Maybe let's add 0.1 to this. Did I break things? Yes, I did. Okay, I know what I need to do. Okay, let's add in a new vec2. So vec2, and let's add some distortion in. And let's make this equal to a vec2. And then in round brackets, we'll do 0.0, 0.1. And then a semicolon at the end is needed, otherwise your things will break. Next, what we're going to do is just add on this UVU. Let's just add distortion at the end of this. So at the moment, the distortion is just shift things over by a certain amount. So this looks a little bit lower. So it is doing something. If we do something like 0.4 here, this will shift it over all by a certain thing. So it's kind of off this edge. But this isn't really what we want to do, right? It's really, we want to add some distortion to this. So how do we go about doing this? Now, there's things that we can use off the shelf to basically make our lives a little bit easier. And the main thing that I'm going to use is an off-the-shelf thing from GLSL FBM. FBM is called fractional Brownian motion, basically adding some kind of cloudy noise, which is kind of what we want to do in the end. So I'm just going to click on this first link. I'll put the links in the description below, and I'm going to use this 3D.GSL. And what we're going to do is just use this code in our code. So I'm going to copy and paste all this code. And where do we put this? I want to use it in my fragment shader. So I'm going to put it on line 32 here, and it's just copy and pasting it like this. So I'm going to save this. And again, this should just be off here right now. So it still should work. But what I want to do is use some of this info of this FBM, which is basically cloudy noise, in my code. So where I've got distortion right now, and again, don't worry too much if you've never done shaders. This is going to be quite quick for an intro to shaders. Let's change this 0.4 to something else. FBM in brackets, VUV. So let's just put that in for now, and let's see what happens. So I'm going to save this. Actually, this isn't going to work. Like, we need more than this. So we need to change this. So vec3 in round brackets, uvu.x, comma, uvu.y, comma, 0.1. 0.0, let's say. Phew, okay. Hopefully this should work. So what we should get now is this kind of noisy version of this, which kind of looks quite cool. And it's shifted off to the side as well. So what's going on here? So what we've got, and I'm just going to space this out a little bit as well. So I'm going to put some enters in here, enter in here, enter in here. So we've got a distortion that's running in 2 directions, X and Y. The Y direction is 0.1, so it's always going to shift things just a little bit down. For now, we could just make this 0.0 so it doesn't have any distortion in the Y direction. And there we go. We can see it kind of like moving in like this. However, what this FBM is doing is it's saying, make me a cloud based on the X and Y position of these points and no other kind of thing in the Z direction. So it's just going to give me a number that's between 0 and 1. So this number is between 0 and 1. And the average of this is going to be 0.5, which is why it's shifted off to this side. So let's just basically shift it back into the middle. What we're going to do is say mix around this. I'm going to put mix around this, which is a function in GLSL. And what we're going to say is, how far do we want to shift this by? Well, what we want to shift it by for now is minus 0.1 and plus 0.1. So let's see if this works. So we can see that there's slight shifts in this. It's a little bit weird, but what we can see is if I increase the distortion to 0.2, we're still in the middle, but we're having this wiggly kind of effect going on. So this looks a little bit more processed than it did before. The original is still the same shape, but now what we have is our texture is being moved around. So what we've got now is some kind of distortion going on here. Now, there's other things I can start to add into this. So what I'm just going to quickly do is take this 0.2 and just save it to a variable. Now, it's not const, it's not let, because we're not in JavaScript. We're in GLSL. So I'm going to say float for D size. This is going to be equal to 0.1. So this is how much distortion that I want to use. Currently I'm using 0.2 in both, but I could make it a little bit higher. So I'm just going to replace this with 0.1 times D size, and this as D size as well. So this is just saying plus and minus 0.1. So if I go back, we'll have the same as before. We'll get this kind of like wiggly look to it. Now, I also want a certain amount, like how cloudy do I want this as well? So I'm going to use another one, float D amount. And I'm just going to make this 12.0 for now with a semicolon at the end. Now, again, this is something that I've kind of played around with and it kind of worked well for me. And this is going to work a little bit differently for you. So let's just see this in action. How do we use this? So let's just add some enters in here. I've got my mix, my max size, and then what I'm changing it by. And then I'm going to add some space in here. And what I'm going to do is take this FBM, this cloud, and then basically times all of this by this D amount. So times D amount. So take all the coordinates and then times them by 12 is kind of what we're saying here. And what we get is this kind of cloudy look that looks something a little bit more like this. Now remember, this is only doing it in the X direction at the moment. In the Y direction, it's currently just 0. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of this mix, these things, and then paste this underneath. Watch out for your commas. There's only one comma at the end. There's no comma here. And what we're going to do is just take this FBM X, Y, and 0. And let's just make this a different number. So not 1. And what we'll get now is this kind of cloudy effect that kind of comes in. And I can still turn this around. This still turns in space as well. But we have this kind of like cloud effect that's using this post-processing now. So this looks pretty cool. But again, there's other things I might want to do here. So what I might want to do is animate this in. So it kind of looks a little bit cloudy all at once without it kind of moving. If I hold this in position, the cloud doesn't move. But I want this cloud to move. How do I do this? Now, there isn't an idea of time in shaders. What we have to do is take time from the outside and pass this in. So what we're going to do is back on main.js. What I want to use from my Three.js is clock. There's a clock that's built into JavaScript. So I'm going to use the clock from Three.js and I'm going to set this up. So before my scene, I'm going to say constant clock. This is going to be a new clock. Now what I want to do is pass in the information about the clock into the shader as part of the uniforms. So further up here we have these uniforms that are passed in. Now I want to pass in this clock information to this. So further down I'm going to say in my noise pass, my noise pass has uniforms, and I want to say there's a uniform that isn't there right now called time. And a time has a value that's equal to this clock's get elapsed time. So this is part of Java. This is part of Three.js. this is part of the shader. We're passing this into the shader itself. But remember, this information updates all the time because the clock updates all the time on render. So I'm going to use this line again here and then put it into my render loop. So I've got my here, and after I'm rotating this, I'm going to pass this in as well. So we're constantly updating the time. Now we're not using time in my noise shader yet, but we're going to. So back in noise shader, I'm going to add a new uniform called time, and it has a value of 0 to begin with, 0.0. And what we want to do is use time in my shaders. So in my shader, I've got my fragment shader. I can use it as uniform something something. I'm going to use it in here as uniform float time because it's a number. And then what I can say in here is now I can use time in something like my FBM. So I've got 0.0, I'm going to say plus time, or I've got 1, I'm going to say plus time. Let's slow that time down. Let's say this time, we'll multiply it by 0.01, so it's a 100th of the speed. It's way too quick. And what we'll get now is this kind of cloudy effect. So even if I hold it, it's still moving, it's still having this cloud effect going on. So what we've done is added a little bit of post-processing in here using a shader. So there's a bit more that I want to do with this shader itself. Now currently I don't want to run it all the time. I only really want to run it on scroll and kind of almost like trend in and trend out on scroll. So how to go about doing this? Well, what I want to do is basically add something into my shader that basically has some kind of effect to this. So what I want to do is say, when is there some effect? Now, what I could say here just quickly is something like float effect. And this is going to be something like 0 when we start. And I want to take all of this distortion and multiply it by that effect. Effect times this. So if there's no effect, there's no distortion. Let's just save that and see if it works. So what we'll get is no distortion. If I basically trend this up to 1, there's a lot of distortion. This is kind of my end goal. So this is kind of what I want to do is I want to have this effect coming from here, but actually coming from the outside based on scroll instead. So I need this effect to come in as a uniform. So I'm going to get rid of float here, and instead I'm going to pass it in as a uniform. So currently I've got uniform float time. I'm going to add a new one, uniform float effect. And I want to pass this in up here as another uniform effect value. Let's start as 0 because it's not going to be 1 to begin with. So this is kind of saying set up the shader ready to go. Now currently there's no effect on the shader. We want to do it from outside instead. So next thing we're going to do back on our main.js is similar to what we have where we had noise pass uniforms time value. We're going to say noise pass uniforms effect value, and let's start that at 0. So next, let's have a look. This looks normal, but I can change this number to 1, and this will increase the effect from outside again. Now what I want to do is control this number of 0 or 1 from the scroll instead. Now to do this, we're going to set up some variables, and we're going to do this using tweening as well. So I've covered tweening a few times in the past, but again, this is just basically go between two numbers. We don't want it to flick between 0 and 1. Instead, we just want it to kind of trend towards 0 and 1 instead. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up two variables. I'm going to do this kind of at the top here, not quite there, but here. We're going to say let the current effect be equal to 0 and let the aim effect be equal to 0. We want to start and end at 0. We only want to change these numbers when we actually scroll. Now currently there isn't a way to scroll. There isn't any function that controls scroll, but let's go and add that in. So we'll add this in further down here. Let's do it after resize. So let's add in a new function called scroll. So as soon as we scroll, what we want to do is change the aim scroll or the aim distortion or aim effect to be 1. Aim effect is 1. Now what we want to do is when we've scrolled, we want to run this scroll function. So I need to add that in next. So window, add event listener, on scroll, aim effect and current effect don't do anything. We're not using them anywhere. And if anything, we can see actually in the noise effect, we're just saying it's 1. So let's replace this noise pass uniforms effect to be the current effect. Now the current effect is always going to be 0 because it never updates. This is always going to be 1. Aim effect is going to be 1, but current effect never updates. Now what I want to do is update my current effect based on my aim effect, so using some tweening. So in my render loop, which is going to run every single frame, I'm going to say the current effect, let's update this. Let's kind of trend it towards the difference between the two. So I'm going to do plus equals, and then the difference between the two. Aim effect minus current effect. But let's tween it. Let's go between two numbers. Let's times this by 0.05, let's say. And again, we can tweak these numbers a little bit later. So let's see how this looks. So now if I scroll, nothing happens. Now the reason that nothing happens is I'm not updating my uniform. I'm updating my uniform for time, but not actually based on this current effect. So in here, what we're going to do is noise pass. Let's update the uniforms. Let's change the effect. And the value of the effect is now the new current effect. So we're always updating this current effect from outside. So what we'll get now is something that looks like this on load. It looks like it's not distorted. And as soon as we scroll, it goes distorted. Now this will never go back because this always goes to 1. Whenever we scroll, the aim effect is always 1. But we want to basically say after a certain amount of time, be it half a second, go back to 1. Or back to 0, sorry. So to do this, we're going to set a timeout. So with this scroll, what we're also going to add in here is a let. Actually, I'm going to add it further up here. So we're going to add it all together. Let timeout effect. So just keeping them all together, basically. So what we want to do is say, if we keep scrolling, we don't want it to run out. But if we stop scrolling after a certain amount of time, then what we want to do is stop this effect. We want to go back to 0. So to do this, what we're going to say is in our scroll, we're going to say clear timeouts. If there's any timeout effects going on, stop it from running. What we want to do after aim effect is timeout effect and say, hey, you finished. Let's set a timeout and say after a certain amount of time, let's run a function. What do we want to run in the function? Well, we want the aim effect to go back to 0. How long do we want to do it? Well, we need to say after this function is run, comma, half a second, let's say. So what we'll say here is have this cloudy effect kind of trending towards this, and then we'll trend back to 0 after half a second of non-scrolling. So let's see if this works. Here, what we get is this kind of trends in and trends out, trends in, trends out, trends in, trends out. And again, we can change some of these numbers to make it look a little bit different. So for instance, if we want it to be a slower trend, what we can do is take our tweening and slow it down 0.01 rather than 0.05. So this trends slower and then fades out slower as well. Again, we can kind of control this. I kind of liked it before like that. And then maybe half a second is too long. Maybe it's something like 300 milliseconds. So this goes down, goes back to normal. There we go. Now, one other thing you might notice as well is if we have quite a long, thin browser, this looks like it's stretched. And that's because shaders have no context of the environment that it's in. So we need to tell it some context. So one more thing we're going to do is pass in an aspect ratio to my noise shader. And let's do that now. So what we have in noise shaders, we have the time, which has come from outside. We have the effect, which has come from outside. We're also going to add in a noise pass uniforms aspect ratio dot value. And aspect ratio is basically the width divided by the height. So the window inner width, inner divided by inner height. Now remember that we want to update this on resize as well. So I'm going to take this line of code and pass it into my resizer as well, which is down here. So I'm going to pass this in. Now remember that we're not using this aspect ratio just yet. We need to actually go and do this. So back on my noise shader, what we're going to do is add one more thing, aspect ratio value by default, it's going to be 1, just a square. And then what we can do is use this in my fragment shader. I'm going to say uniform float aspect ratio. And then what we want to do is basically take the distortion and then multiply it depending on which direction we're talking about. At the moment, we've got an X and a Y direction. Now, which way do we want to do the aspect ratio? Let's just quickly look. It's in the Y direction. So let's take this aspect ratio in this direction, aspect ratio and aspect ratio here. So this is just on the Y direction. We're just matching it to the X direction. So let's save this. And what we'll get now is this looks a little bit more square. There we go. It looks a little bit more natural. It doesn't kind of look as stretched, especially on kind of wider screens. But what we have now is our shader effect using post-processing. It wasn't too difficult to set up, but what we're doing is we're making our Three.js and our actual JavaScript talk to the shader to do the things that we want it to do. So now is the time. We're going to replace our shape with an actual 3D object. So we're going to say goodbye to the Taurus knot and instead import our sneaker. Now, firstly, a big shout out to Craig at Polysphere Creative, who let me use his no-build trainer that he scanned in. Basically what I did is I took this, put it into Houdini, made it this kind of like matte gray color to remove a lot of the branding, and then actually exported it as a GLTF file. Now, if you want to use your own files, that's totally fine. If you don't know where to look for files, there's places like Sketchfab. What you can do on Sketchfab is you can add in lots of these kind of free versions, which are downloadable. So if I wanted to use this cute little fox in a cape, I could use it in my project. All I need to do is go to that, download it, and then use it as a GLTF file. Now, there is a GLTF loader, but there are other ones in here as well. Things like OBJ loader. There's also 3DM loaders. So there's lots of different file types that we can use. I like using GLTF loader because it's quite quick and it's quite condensed and it's open format as well. Now, there is 2 different formats you can use. There's one called GLTF and there's one called GLB, which is binary. I am using the GLB file because it just gives me one big file that I can use in my project, which is actually just really easy for doing things like preloaders. So this is what I'm using. I actually exported it in Houdini as a GLB file that I'm now going to use to import. If your files are slightly different, it would be a slightly different way to import, but generally would look kind of the same. How do we do this? Well, what we need to do is import it as an add-on and then follow the instructions. So first thing we're going to do is add it in. So I'm going to take this line of code and then add it in as an import. There we go. Now, what we're going to do is then replace our actual shape. So I'm going to go down to our shape, which is in here. We've got a geometry, material, and shape. So I'm going to get rid of these lines. And what we're going to do is import it instead. Now, remember that the materials do come from the actual exported file. So we're kind of set up ready to go. So let's do our object import here. Now, the first thing we need to do is use that GLTF loader. So I'm going to do a constant GLTF loader. This is equal to the new GLTF loader. Now, why did I not just call it loader like the instructions? So there's here, it says add a loader. Now, if I have like a font loader and I've got an image loader, I just want to make sure I'm using the right one. So I'm just calling it GLTF loader. Next thing you need to do is follow the instructions. It says, where does this live? And then we have some functions to run and add things. So we're going to do that next. So GLTF loader, we're going to do .load. First thing we need to do is say where this thing is. Mine's called sneaker.gbl, so I'm going to do sneaker.glb. The next thing we need to do is write a function to say what happens when we load this. So I'm going to do this as comma and then a function. Now this will give me some information about the object itself. So this will be called something like GLTF or sneaker or something like that. GLTF is what I'm going to call it. This is the kind of model that's come in. What do we want to do when the model has come in? Well, I want to add it to the scene. So I'm going to open these curly brackets and say scene.add GLTF. And then in here, we want to do .scene. Because GLTF gives us some more stuff in here. It gives us things like lights and animations too. So let's see if this worked. Save. So hopefully, fingers crossed, what we'll get is this loading in. And we should get nothing at all. Okay, what do we need to do here? Now, there's a few things that we need to do. Firstly, like we need to add it to the right load path. So here what we want to do is add it in the right place. So let's just move this down a little bit. Let's move this down under our scroll group. Because what we want to do is add this to our load group, because this is where we added shape. So I'm going to take this load group, remove it, because we don't have the shape anymore, and say we want to do a scene, add GLTF scene. So we want to do this on the load group now. So let's see if this worked. What we'll get now is if we refresh, we'll see our sneaker, and it will still load around, and it still will be distorted as well. So this looks pretty good. It's doing what we had with the shape originally, but it seems a little bit far away. Now, the reason it's far away is just the camera is far away, and we can change the camera if we scroll down. We've got camera position Z. This is at 5, maybe something like 2. See if that works. Zoom in a little bit, move closer. There we go. Looks pretty good. We have our shoe loading in, and we have the post-processing effects working very, very quickly. But the one thing you might notice as well is, especially when we load live, we want to do all of these effects when we've loaded the shoe. And the moment they're doing it before we've loaded the shoe, because they're all running where we do things like this. So what I'm going to do is move certain things into my GLTF loader. So I've got my load group, I'm adding the shape, and then I want to load it in. So I'm going to take this animate, which is from here to here. I'm going to cut it out and paste it in my function now. So once we've loaded, we then animate. Save. So now what we'll get is this loading in and then moving up. Now I might want to do the same thing for these areas as well. So for instance, like this normal sneakers and this kind of background as well. Because if I have a preloader, which I'm going to add, we want to do this after the preloader is finished. So there's going to be a few things that we're going to move into this loader. So I'm going to scroll up and I'm going to get my stuff from header and new drop. I'm going to take this and move it into my function. So I've got my loading function, and once it's loaded, then I do the header and the new drop. So now if I refresh, what we'll get is this kind of moving all together. Now this is kind of hard to see because we're doing it locally, because obviously we've loaded the shoe already, but this is 5 megabytes. So it could take a little bit of time when we get it on the internet to do it. So this is just saying, wait till we do this. But one thing we might want to do is make sure that this header and new drop section aren't showing when we show this. We want to wait for this to load it and then fade it in. But this header will still be here by default. So what I'm just going to do before this is animate the header and say we want Y to be -100 and the opacity to be 0 by default. And the same thing for new drop as well. So I'm going to do the same thing here for section new drop. So this is saying do this straight away and then animate in. So what we'll get now is if I refresh, they'll wait and then fade in. So this is a little bit more kind of what we want. We want to do the animation and then wait, and when it's done, then load it in. So if we quickly look at our GLTF loader, what we can see in here, there is other things that we can actually add in as functions. So we added our where it is, we've added a function for what happens on load, but we can also do things of what happens while it's loading and what happens if there's an error. So what I can do next is add these 2 extra functions in here to give me a preloader. So what we're going to do is add a preloader. So I've got my function from here all the way to this 104. I'm going to add in another function at the end of this. So comma and then another function. And this is going to be my preloader. And I'm going to add another function, a comma, and then another function. And that's my error. And again, this is just how this particular add-on works. Now, if there's an error, what do I want to do? Well, I want to say there's some kind of error happening, or maybe kind of like, you know, console error, just to see what's going on. So I'm going to do the error first. I'm going to say if there's an error, I can say console error, and then what the error is. So just basically tell me what's going wrong. And then what I want to do is maybe add, you know, does it matter? Do I want to fade things in? Well, I might want to fade in the header and this new drop area. So, you know, I could do that a little bit later. For now, I'm just going to ignore this, but I might want to fade the things in anyway if it doesn't load properly. But what I want to do is a preloader. So in here, what we can say is this gives us some information about what is happening, how much is loaded, and how heavy is this. So what we can say here, and I'm going to use this as XHR as well, is I have some info about how heavy this is and what percentage we want to load as. But at the moment we don't have a preloader, so how do we add this in? Well, what we're going to do is quickly go into my index.html and I'm going to add in a preloader. So here I'm going to say a div with a class of loader, and then I'm going to add a span tag in here with 0% is as loaded. Let's just quickly style this up. So let's see what this looks like right now. This will just be technically, where is it? I don't really know where it is right now, but let's add this in anyway. So at the bottom, we're going to do div.loader, and then let's make this position fixed, top 0, left 0, width 100%, height 100%. Let's make this z-index 3, so it's above everything. And then let's add a color, background color on this of the variable secondary color. Let's give it a text color in here as well. So var primary color. Let's put some padding on this, something like 2 rem. Let's give it a font size of 3 rem. And what else? Let's make it do display flex, and let's align items in the end. So it's going to be in the bottom corner. So how does this look now? There we go. We've got our 0% in the corner. Maybe let's make it even bigger. Let's make it something like 6 rem. Make it really chunky. There we go. Now what we can do is update this number and then remove it once we've loaded. So that's what we're going to do next. Next, what we're going to say is let's go back to our main.js. What I want to do is update that span tag and basically say, well, let's update that. Well, do we need the span tag? Yeah, because we put it in the bottom corner. So let's first of all go up. Let's pick our sneaker tag, but then let's pick our loader tag. In our document, let's do a query selector div.loader. Next, what we want to do is update our span tag in there with that HTML. So back in our XHR, we're going to get the loader tag. We'll say query selector for the span, and let's update its inner HTML to be equal to what? Well, we can see in our code on our Three.js, it's this divided by this times this. So I'm going to basically copy this. So I'm going to copy this and all of that and make it equal to this. So what we get is how much is loaded, how much is total, times 100 to get a percentage, and then what we get is a percentage sign loaded. I don't need the loaded at the end, so let's see how this looks. So we'll go back, and we can see here that occasionally we'll get these kind of rounded numbers. So I want to make this kind of thing rounded. So let's just make this have math.round and then put some round brackets around this equation. Now, just to make this a little bit easier to see what's going on, I'm just going to actually make this a constant of p for percentage, and then let's get that number out from here, and let's make that equal to p plus percentage sign. So what I've done is basically taken the number and just rounded it. So if it's 99.5, I'll just say 99 or 100, and then what we'll get is a percentage sign at the end. So now what we get is a percentage sign. It's loaded, but we need to get rid of it. So to get rid of it, I can use animate. So I'm going to use animate in the loading area, by the way, and say div.loader. What we want to say is the y is minus 100%. And then what we want to do is a duration of 1. Does this work? Let's see. So because it loads pretty quickly, it goes away pretty quickly as well, and then fades in. Maybe there's a bit of a delay, so let's add a delay of a second on this as well. So 100%, and then goes away. And again, because this is loaded locally, it's pretty quick to load, so it's always going to look like 100%. But what we've got is a preloader now. So once we're happy with what we've done, how do we actually finish this off? How do we build it? We've got a build system with Vite. How do we use it? So the first thing we need to do is go on this terminal. We need to cancel out the terminal by doing Control and C to basically get back to the command line. Now to build this, what we're going to do is follow the instructions on Vite. It's basically npm run build. And what this will do is it will take all of our code and kind of mash it down. And what it will finally give us is this dist folder. So what we'll get in here, if we just open it up in Finder, is we have our website, and what we can do is go into dist, and then what we have is this is the site that we would actually deploy. We'd actually take this folder and then upload it to where we want it to be. We could do it on GitHub, we can do it on Vercel, we can do it on Amazon Web Services. This is just a static website. So what we'll get here is a much smaller version of everything. This is our build system, and then we run npm run build whenever we finished, and then we can upload it, and then we can get it online. So what we've done in a fairly short amount of time is made a Three.js website with lots of scroll effects and shaders on here as well. So what I wanted to basically show as part of this project is some of these sites, they're not like weeks and weeks of work, they're just how you put things together in a new way. So one thing to kind of keep in mind is having the power of knowledge to know how to put things together. These things can seem impenetrable and really hard to kind of work out, but with a little bit of knowledge and a fairly short amount of time relatively, we can build something that's a professional grade website that doesn't look terrible. It looks really, really good, and it looks like it could win awards. There's obviously lots of things we can do to kind of keep polishing this and keep this looking better, but what we have now is a very professional level site that uses Three.js in a very short amount of time. And that's it. I've been your host Rick, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. It lets me know I should do some more of these. If you don't like it, I won't do any more of them. And if there's anything you'd like me to cover in the future, please add it in the comments below. I'd love to hear all your comments. I read them all. I reply to them all as well. So please let me know what you want me to cover. And there should be 2 more videos for you to watch right here, right now. So I'll see you in another video very soon.